January.
This is an oral history with Tim Rehder of the Environmental Protection Agency, and the interviewer is Dorothy Charlo, and we're doing this oral history for the Rocky Flats Cold War Museum and for the Carnegie Library Oral History Program. And today's date is January 3rd, 2006. Thank you very much, Tim. And as I mentioned, the first question I'll ask you is, when and where were you born?
I was born right here in Denver, Colorado, back in 1958, May 14th of that year.
Okay. And could you describe something about your family background? And
well, both my parents grew up in farms. My father's parents' farm in Minnesota, and my mom's in North Dakota. My father, well, my mother especially came from a large farming family. Yeah.
And in Denver, did you have brothers and sisters, and what kind of work did your parents do?
My dad worked at Coors for about the last 10 years of his working life, and my mom was a banker at various places. Yeah, and I have a brother and sister who still live local.
And where did you go to school? Did you?
Well, elementary school in Thornton and North Glen, and junior high and high school up in Idaho Springs, and then an undergraduate degree in Western State of Colorado in Gunnison, Colorado, and a graduate degree from Southern Methodist University down in Dallas, Texas.
And then did you start working for the EPA right away after graduating from
It wasn't too long out of graduate school. I studied geology in school, and I went to work for an oil company for a short time after I graduated with my master's degree, and then went to EPA's shortly thereafter.
What drew you to the EPA? Can you say?
At the time, no, I'm not sure. I needed a job.
Yeah, okay, fine. Yeah. And let's see, did you work at the EPA for some time before you started the Rocky Flats work?
Yes. Yes.
Could you describe a little bit about different things you worked on?
When I was first hired, very quickly I was put in charge of the Denver Radium site cleanup, which was a cleanup of radioactive materials that date way back to the turn of the century, or the turn of the last century, the early 1900s, when radium was used by Americans and Europeans for a lot of different purposes, from health to well, I guess most of it was general feel-good recipes and some cancer cures, although now we probably think it may have caused cancer more than it cured it. But anyway, yeah, there was about 40 properties that were contaminated with radium along the Platte River, and they had largely been forgotten because the radium industry went belly up pretty much overnight back in the 1920s. So a lot of factories and businesses had been built on top of these old contaminated sites. So EPA had to go back in and relocate some businesses and work around some businesses and excavate all this stuff up. So there was about, yeah, I don't know, 800,000 tons of material that was shipped off for disposal from the Denver radium site.
Interesting.
And I also, well, and after that, the agency sent me to Europe for a couple years to help the Army with some hazardous waste management programs they had there, as well as just some general pollution prevention training for Army personnel, mostly motor pool personnel. And then when I came back from Europe, they gave me another radioactive site to clean up. That was called Ramp Industries Inc., and it was in northwest Denver. small broker of radioactive waste. This guy was supposed to collect radioactive waste in small quantities from hospitals and research facilities and then dispose of them when he had enough. What he really did was take their money and stack the drums on his property until he was so in debt he just abandoned. Anyway, we took over that site with about 5,000 leaky drums in a low-income neighborhood. So by the time the Rocky Flats position here came open, well, I had a lot of experience cleaning up radioactive stuff, so I guess I was a shoo-in for the job.
Now, were any of these other projects that you worked on Superfund sites, or?
Denver Radium site was a Superfund site. Ramp Industries Inc. was a Superfund site too. Yeah.
I'm not sure I know exactly what defines a Superfund site. Maybe you could speak to that. Because I know that Rocky Flats became named as a Superfund site, although it wasn't initially. Is that right?
Well, Rocky Flats existed before the Superfund law came into effect. And I am now at a loss to tell you exactly when it became part of the Superfund list. But, you know, the Superfund law was put in place by Congress to address, in theory, abandoned hazardous waste sites. Rocky Flats was not abandoned, and it was originally regulated under the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act law, RCRA, which is supposed to handle, you know, active facilities that are managing hazardous waste. I guess, and I don't know all the thinking of this, because by the time I got to the project in 95, you know, it had been on the Superfund list for some time. But I think the thinking may have been that some of the contamination was from fires that spread things outside of what would normally have occurred during an industrial process. So it made some sense to address it under Superfund.
What did you apply for the position, or were you selected or appointed, or?
Right, exactly. The EPA has had a team of 4 or 5 engineers doing work on Superfund stuff, or rather overseeing the efforts of Department of Energy to clean up. And they had a team leader who had been working on the project for a number of years, overseeing this team of other engineers who were in turn overseeing the Department of Energy's efforts. So that person wanted to move on to another project, so yeah, they asked for people to put their name in the hat to be the team leader for the Rocky Flats cleanup, or EPA's team. And so
you did so.
Yeah, and I did so.
Did you know what you were getting into? Or is that a fair question?
Oh, I think that's a fair question. Well, I knew it was a high-profile site. I knew it was going to be in the news a fair amount. I knew that there were activists who were very unhappy with the way the project was going. But I wasn't really prepared for the degree of scrutiny, the degree of emotion that people who were interested in the site brought to the project or brought to their activism. Sometimes there were, you know, personal attacks that I took personally, and that I never would have thought that. I mean, I did not anticipate. You know, one of the funnier things about one of the funnier events that I was part of was it wasn't even at Rocky Flats per se, but Broomfield wanted to build a jail down there near Great Western Reservoir. So they wanted to build it. Broomfield wanted to build this jail at basically the northeast corner of the site. And there was a neighborhood nearby that was really against having the jail. I mean, they lived pretty close to Rocky Flats for years and years and years, and were fairly comfortable with that, but they didn't want to be close to a jail. So one of the reasons that they, what the reasons they brought up for not building the jail was that it was contaminated. So they asked me to come to this public meeting and talk about contamination and how it affected the jail. So I got up and I said, you know, there's no reason from a Rocky Flats standpoint or a contamination standpoint why this jail can't be here. We have lots of samples that show that the lion's share of contamination by far is on the site and is miles away from this jail site. And you know, I got questions saying, well, we know that there's a river of plutonium heading this way. And I said, no, there's really not. We have thousands of wells. We've taken thousands of samples of groundwater. I can objectively say, or matter-of-factly say, that there's no river of plutonium heading towards your neighborhood. And I never in my life thought that I would get in front of a giant crowd of people and tell them that there was no plutonium flowing towards them and have them being disappointed by that. They were all disappointed. They all wanted to run me out. That was kind of good news I was giving them. Yeah.
Now, did that happen early on in your experience?
No, I'd been a few. I was pretty
prepared.
well. I was pretty seasoned in about going in front of crowds by that time.
Yeah. Well, now, when you first started, let's see, what were your initial reactions? And maybe you could describe what your job with EPA was in contrast, say, to the Department of Health, or those are the two.
When I first started, they were in the throes of negotiating this Rocky Flats cleanup agreement, the RFCA, which I'm sure you've heard a lot about. And the first year of my job was, weekly meetings for RFCA negotiation, and it took a year. And
so it wasn't completed before you started?
No.
It was in process?
No, I was in process, and so we negotiated every word of that stupid agreement over and over. And
so then
at the same time, Kaiser-Hill had been on the job for about a year, so they were starting to do some cleanup stuff. One of the things that Kaiser-Hill had asked for was a lack of regulatory, or a clarification on regulatory oversights. They were complaining, and DOE was complaining, that they were getting regulated doubly. They were getting regulated by the state of Colorado and by the EPA, and that sometimes they get conflicting messages and they didn't know who to follow. And I'm not sure it was ever as bad as they described it, but they were always coming up with the reasons why why things weren't as good as they wanted. But anyway, that did make sense. So we kind of broke the project out, where the state, with their authority over hazardous waste under that Resource Conservation and Recovery Act law, would regulate the interior operations, and that EPA would kind of take the lead on regulating the buffer zone, the areas just where we'd had releases to the environment of contaminants from dumping, and from releases from the fire and from water and stuff. So like the contaminated ponds and some of the disposal trenches and the old landfills and the big area of windblown contamination from the '69 fire, that was all in the EPA zone. And then all the stuff in the buildings themselves and the areas between the buildings, that was in the Colorado zone, or the Department of Health zone. Kind of split it up that way, so that if Kaiser-Hill had to, and DOE had a cleanup plan for this part of the site, the buffer zone, they'd come to EPA, and I mean, it didn't work perfectly because sometimes we didn't like exactly what Colorado had to say about something in the industrial area, and sometimes Colorado didn't like what we had to say exact. So there was still some overlap in the regulatory roles, but for the most part it worked well. Breaking it up that way.
And you worked with probably a key person at the health.
Right,
health.
right.
Who was that?
Initially, when I started, it was Steve Tarleton, and then it was Steve Gunderson after that. You talked to him?
I haven't, but I think the other interviewer has.
Uh-huh.
He's on the list.
Sure, he'd be a key one to talk to.
Uh-huh.
Oh, okay, so I'm not sure. Was there another part of that question?
Well, no, I think you kind of described the cleanup agreement. Then you were a part of
negotiating that cleanup agreement. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And how was that received? Was the agreement really between Kaiser-Hill as well as DOE, or was it really just between DOE?
No, it was between DOE, EPA, and the state of Colorado.
Okay. Mm-hmm. And Kaiser-Hill simply implemented it then?
Correct. Right. It was supposed to lay out a framework for, how clean is clean, which is always a big question in these instances, and for, how procedurally, how would things operate, and it described that breakup of that split in regulatory oversight roles between the EPA and the state of Colorado.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's see. When I have heard or read that there were some trenches excavated that created some problems. Can you speak to that? Was that a part of when you were working with?
Yeah, and I suspect those were the trenches 3 and 4, and the problems were that we actually measured some off-site contamination during that period. Is that what?
Yes, I think that's what I had heard.
Yeah, that was a big problem. Well,
can you
yes and
describe
no.
that?
They had, there was these trenches, and we knew that they had some hazardous materials in them. And
these were the trenches that had been kind of dumped in years and years earlier,
yeah,
right?
exactly. Yeah, I think they were filled in the 50s and 60s. So we were expecting some radioactive materials, not a lot, because we had done test borings and gotten samples. And they found a lot of debris, and there was a drum that didn't even look like a drum. It was so badly rusted. And one of the Kaiser-Hill personnel decided to crush it so they could get it into a container for disposal. Well, apparently I wasn't there at the day they did that, but I'd been up that morning and was up the next day. Anyway, they crushed this drum. They called it a drum, but really it was a mangled piece of, and I'm not sure that really could hold anything, but someone reported they saw a little puff go up when they crushed it. And these were just drum fragments, and they were dirty, and I would expect something to come up when something like that got crushed. Anyway, someone on site declared it a site emergency and shut down the project. And I was a little skeptical about them shutting down the project because I'd done a lot of these projects before, and you do raise some dust sometimes, but it doesn't go very far, and you have large areas encased, and you can't do these kind of projects with like zero emission. You just can't dig outside of hazardous material and expect not a few atoms to go. So I got the impression, well, yeah, I really got my butt chewed over this whole thing, because I really thought they were being a little over conservative, because I thought, you're going to clean up this place and want to do it in 10 years, want to do it with a reasonable amount of money, and you're shutting down the project because a tiny amount of dust come off this drum that wasn't really a drum. It was like an old piece of a drum. It was a drum 50 years ago when they put it in, but now it's a rusted part of a carcass. And that had been my initial observations when I went to Rocky Flats too, was that they were always looking for reasons not to work. You know, if someone knocked over a ladder accidentally, they would study it for a week or two. And or if someone dropped a pliers, they would study that for a week. Any reason not, it seemed to me they were always looking for reasons not to work. And admittedly, it's very dangerous work. You really have to plan that stuff. So I understood the way that they were so cautious about making bombs, but it was my opinion they had taken this super analysis method of doing all their work, of analyzing everything to the nth degree. They had done it for so long with so much money coming in and such a secretive environment with no oversight that they took this mentality that they applied to bomb making and applied it to everything else on the site. So if they're going to change out one of these light bulbs, well, they had 5 people in there and they analyzed it and they had all these different sign-offs. And quite honestly, it made for an incredibly inefficient operation. And when Kaiser-Hill took over, they started to change things, but a lot of that was ingrained, and by the time I got there, it's still, if they were to move a drum of waste from one part of a building to another, you'd see 5 people with clipboards watching and people with cameras, and it was just incredibly inefficient and very slow. And so this T3, T4 incident, when I heard they had shut down and were doing this big investigation of root cause analysis, and I just thought, you're kidding me. If we'd have done this every time we dropped a cupful of dirt at the Denver Radium project, we never would have got that project done. You know, that project cost $80 million as it was, and it would. But if we'd have done it Rocky Flat style, it would have cost $8 billion. So I wrote a letter to DOE saying, hey, this wasn't that bad. Let's not make a big federal case out of this. Let's get on with work. Well, there are a couple people in the community who got very mad about that. They felt I was playing fast and loose with everyone's health and safety, and that I was. They didn't like the project. They didn't like how it was being done, and they thought if someone called into question the safety of this project, that EPA should be calling it into question tenfold more. So I got my rear end chewed out by a couple of local politicians over that one.
Oh, local politicians, not just activists then. It filtered.
Well, there was one local politician who really chewed me out, and then the activist groups really jumped on me too.
Are you at liberty to say the politician's name, or would you prefer not to?
It was Hank Stovall.
Okay.
Yeah, he's a grumpy old man. Yeah, he is threatening to call for my job and all this stuff, and
Well, now, did you feel at that time, or in other times too, did you feel support by the EPA, by the agency?
Oh, very much. Yeah, I explained my concerns to my bosses here, and they had no problem with the judgment I made on that. It's kind of this hypersensitivity that went with Rocky Flats.
Right.
Because when you compare environmental risks from that project to other things, I mean, Rocky Flats was a dangerous place without a doubt, and the plutonium workers making bombs were, especially when they were in their heyday and really doing it quickly, from what I understand, they obviously were putting their lives at risk for a project of great national importance, great international importance. But some of the things we argue about on the cleanup didn't justify, and the risks really didn't justify all the attention and all the money we spent doing it, some of them. Because if you would have, like some of the things we did with some of these projects, additional, tents with supplied air on the people when respirators probably would have done fine. If you'd have calculated the dollars spent doing that and the amount of risk you avoided by doing that, and compared that to the environmental risk just from breathing the air that comes off of Highway 36 in a day, you'd probably find that there was greater risk coming from the traffic fumes. But when you talk about plutonium, it's hard to get people to go beyond their emotion to a pure risk level. And admittedly, we don't know everything about plutonium health risks. Just like we don't know everything about the health effects from the air we breathe when we drive on I-25. But from what we do know, it seemed like we were overblowing it. Yeah.
Now, I
At times.
think that you were probably involved when there was this sort of community pressure to
relook at the soil action levels.
Yes.
Oh yeah, oh yeah.
Could you kind of talk about that?
After we cleaned up after we negotiated the cleanup agreement, and the cleanup agreement was a big, for years the question was how clean is clean at Rocky Flats. And when I first started there, Steve Tarleton from the state took me on a site tour and said, well, this is the cleanup level we're going to be getting to, and it was something like 2 or 3 disintegrations a minute, and I thought, well, gosh, that's really, really low. I thought, that's 5 or 6 times cleaner than we cleaned the Denver Radium site up to, and that was what I thought a very conservative cleanup. And radium's really more dangerous than plutonium. And so I thought, that seems like a really conservative number. So the cleanup agreement gave us a framework, and that was a very important thing because, again, for years they've been arguing how clean is clean at Rocky Flats. Are we going to get it? I think, well, I can't remember if Roy Romer said he wanted to grow his tomatoes in the dirt. I think that was actually at the arsenal, but it kind of set a precedent. It's like, okay, so the governor saying, I want to clean up these former defense facilities so I can grow tomatoes out there. And so the cleanup agreement was a big step forward in that it kind of said, well, no, we're not going to necessarily clean this up so everybody can grow tomatoes. There's a lot of competing interests for government money, a lot of different needs for tax dollars, and getting Rocky Flats so we can grow tomatoes are just going to be exorbitant. So we'll just get it so that we can have open space use and maybe some light industrial use in the center. So that was a big step forward that came out of the cleanup agreement.
And that was in the cleanup agreement?
That was in the cleanup agreement, basically, yeah. It's like we're not going to clean it up so you can build a subdivision there. We're just going to clean it up to keep it in open space.
Yeah.
So then once you have a future use mapped out, so to speak, then you can do the calculations using the risk assessors and the modeling tools and say, well, how much contamination in dirt would amount to an acceptable risk given this future land use. And that's what we did. And EPA at the time had a rule for how radioactive sites should be cleaned up to certain levels so that you wouldn't get more than a specific dose in a year. And EPA had a computer program. Well, actually, it was a computer program that had been developed probably by Department of Energy, but it was one that a number of EPA folks were saying was acceptable. And I had a health physicist here at EPA who was advising me, and he said, oh yeah, we can use this computer program and put in some parameters and it'll spit out a number. So we did. We put in some parameters, it spit out a number, and it was way higher than I was thinking. We cleaned up the Denver Radium site to 15 picocuries. Our number was 600 and some, like 650 picocuries of plutonium, and I thought, oh gosh. I had thought the early number I'd heard from the guy from the state was low, but this number is really high. How can that be? Well, and especially compared to what I'd been used to at the radium sites. But plutonium has a much longer half-life than radium. Plutonium is actually not as dangerous as radium because radium kicks off gamma rays and radon, and plutonium just doesn't do those things. So I thought, well, okay, and I checked with the health physicist, and I thought, well, this is what the model says. Is this the right number? And he said, oh yeah, this is good. So I said, well, okay. I thought to myself, well, I'm a scientist, and this is what science is telling us, so I guess it's okay. So I advocated hard for that number to be accepted, and got my bosses here basically to buy off on it. It was funny though, because I got a call from the state, the head of the radiation department at the state at the time, saying that number's too high. It's going to cause a big public relations fiasco. You need to divide it by a public relations acceptability factor. And you know, I was thinking, you know, you're the head of the radiation department. You have more clout than I do. Why don't you do it? And and he said, no, politically, I just can't. And I thought, well, I guess I was just so naive, and still at that point thinking, well, I'm a scientist, and I can communicate risk, and I'll just make people understand that this is the right number. Well, I was way, way wrong. And if I'd have just taken his advice and divided it by 10, we probably would have saved, I don't know, millions of dollars of staff time, certainly, and hundreds of hours spent in public meetings, arguing over every little thing. And, you know, we ended up with a number that was about 10 times less.
And that was after a special study?
Oh gosh, like a 2-3 year period where DOE gave a grant to a citizens group, and the citizens group hired this high-priced, overpriced in my mind, scientists to recalculate the number and come up with their own recommendation. And it was, and in my mind, it was kind of a farce of a process, because they asked for bids from a number of different scientists, and they got a number of entities willing to compete to do this basically recalculation of the cleanup number, and they chose the most expensive one by far, and I thought for sure it was because he had promised them the lowest number. I didn't really think it had anything to do with merit. So it was a, gosh, at least 2-year process. And then once we got the recommendation from this guy, we redid all our calculations, because, well, some of the things he put into his calculation were just nonsensical in my mind. He calculated a number that would be protective for a rancher living on the site. And, you know, this rancher grew all his own vegetables and grew all his own beef on the site. And this rancher hardly ever left the site. And this rancher managed to ranch and farm even after big fires had denuded the site. It was an incredibly apocalyptic scenario that they were protecting for, and I just didn't believe, well, for one thing, guidance that EPA said we should try and clean up so that we're looking at a realistic future use, because if you always take the worst possible future use, then you're always trying to clean up these sites to, you know, provide places for, you know, daycare centers, when really that's never going to be their future use. Mm-hmm. And I mean, on one hand, it's nice to bring it back to as pristine as possible, but again, I'd always look at resources, the kind of money they were spending. If they were spending $600 million a year out there, $700 million a year out there, I always kept thinking, you know, the metro area would be much better if we could take 1 year's $700 million and build light rail between Denver and Boulder. It would save a lot more lives. It would improve a lot of people's health much more dramatically. So I was always trying to be a realist, and it worked to some extent.
Yes. But now you probably had to be in on many of these community meetings.
Oh gosh, everyone, practically. Yeah, sometimes I'd feign illness to get out of a couple, but no, I was usually I was usually there. Yeah.
Can you recall any that were especially fiery?
Yeah, well, fiery is a...
Maybe that's not the right word.
No, that's really quite funny to say that, because when it became clear that it was going to become a national wildlife well, actually, I guess at that point it may not have been, the legislation wasn't approved that it was going to become a wildlife refuge, but the idea, I think, was out there that it would become a wildlife refuge. And for years we've been talking about grassland management, because this is a xeric shortgrass prairie and one of the few areas along the Front Range that still, since it had been cut off from development, still looked something like the original prairie would have when settlers came across a couple hundred years ago. So the idea was, there was always talk about how do we best manage the site to keep invasive species away and keep noxious weeds out and the like. And the wildlife managers, the people who really know, the botanists and the biologists, would always say, well, prairie systems respond best to wildfire, and it'd be good if we do controlled burns. So the site, and I had actually, I thought so too. I thought, well, we could do controlled burns in areas of the site. We need to keep it away from the buffer zone, keep it away from the 903 pad, the contaminated areas, but we should do controlled burns because, yes, we want this prairie habitat to be as close as possible to its pre-development conditions, and it's worth saving. So I always thought that controlled burns were a good idea. But boy, that got a lot of people upset when he started talking about controlled burns at Rocky Flats. So yeah, the most contentious public debate I was ever in on was when DOE went out in front of the public and said, this is what we want to do. We want to do some controlled burns. Yeah. I didn't really have a big speaking role that night, and I was happy, because yeah.
Others had to take the heat.
The one DOE guy who was the main talker, he one of the crowd said, I hope you burn in hell. Yeah.
So you must have learned a lot about how to, manage your own feelings and conflict management in meetings such as this.
Well, yeah, I learned lessons on that. I didn't always follow those lessons. I mean, there were times, well, yes, people blew up in some of these meetings at times. And I got rough. There was a couple people that I got pretty short with at times. Members of the public that were consistently bringing up the same points. Yeah, I tried to be a good, patient listener, but sometimes I just kind of blew a fuse.
It sounds like it was a hard job.
I'm happy I'm not still working on that. I mean, it's pretty much done now, but when I left the project, I did not look back and say, oh gosh, wish I was back at Rocky Flats.
Let's see how we've still got time on this. How do you think that your role with EPA was different from, say, the health department? I mean, you've talked about how you differentiated the roles, but did you come at it from a different point of view, do you think, from the health department people?
It's funny, I thought that evolved over time. When I first took the project, I thought I was kind of the bringer of common sense, really. I kind of thought I was bringing a more realistic outlook to the project. I thought that some of the things the state was asking for were a little bit over the top, that they were asking for a Cadillac remedy when really the federal government could probably only afford a nice Ford of a remedy. So I thought, yeah, I thought...
Do you think that's the difference between the state perspective and the federal perspective? Or
No, because really, I thought the state started to loosen up more, and then my later years in the project, I thought I was really kind of the hard guy saying, no, you can afford to do better than this. So it really did kind of reverse. I thought, and I'm not sure why. I don't know if it was because the state had a strong Republican administration and the cleanup was being pushed by a Republican administration. But I felt that the state governor's office really wanted the cleanup to succeed and end on time. And I felt that I had to hold the project to a little tighter cleanup levels, a little more strict interpretation of the cleanup agreement than I thought some of the people at the state were doing at the time. It was really quite a reversal.
Shifted.
Yeah, yeah.
You think it was the different person, or, well, partly the change in the politics?
I don't know where the direction was coming from in the state, but I did get the feeling that they really wanted the project to end on time, and I understood that. I mean, there were concerns on everybody's part that if, well, a lot of people's part that if this project didn't complete on time, that if it went into the kind of stalemate negotiation and haggling that Rocky Flats had been prior to the cleanup agreement being signed, and that the kind of situation that the other DOE sites seem to be in, where there's constant bickering between the state and the DOE and the community, and they can never agree on anything, and consequently nothing good is done. You know, people felt that if we came to that kind of logjam at Rocky Flats, that we could lose the priority that we've been given, because we were getting a huge amount of money. We were obviously the priority project for the DOE cleanup program, and it was because and we were getting that priority on the funding because we had a cleanup goal that everyone had agreed to, in theory. So I understood that the need was to get it done and to make sure that we kept progressing, and I always kept that in the back of my mind. But at the same time, too, I thought, Kaiser-Hill, they had an incentive to end early. They had an incentive to save money, and I felt that they were trying to, in some cases, cut the project shorter than they needed to and not be as aggressive in some of the cleanup programs, some of the cleanup goals as they could have been.
Did you continue to feel that way? I mean, was that just at particular points, but kind of looking back on it, do you still have an uncomfortable feeling about that incentivized cleanup process that kept them working so fast to get more money?
No, I think the incentivized cleanup process, the incentivized contract that they have, was absolutely critical to this job being done.
Okay, because that would fit with what you said before. The whole workforce wasn't oriented that way.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. The way the project was before Kaiser-Hill came in and got their incentivized contract was, as I imagine a communist country would have been run in the 70s and 80s. There was just no incentive to do any work, so no one really cared. You got the same bonus whether you did it or not. So I think having the incentivized project and putting the project on a fast track and with some aggressive targets and deadlines, that was absolutely critical. But putting that into place, then it was then it made the regulator's job, my job, and my counterpart, the state's jobs, even more important.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because if the cleanup had gone as under the contract mechanism that Rockwell, the predecessors to Kaiser-Hill, had, then where they basically kind of got bonuses depending on how much money they spent, not on how much work they did, then Rocky Flat, they'd still be cleaning up there. They'd be a third of the way done. So yeah, no, there's no doubt in my mind that the way to do these projects are to structure the contracts the way they did it. There's no doubt in my mind. But it only enforces the need to have very strict independent regulators. Because certainly DOE didn't do a good job of it. And if it hadn't been for EPA and the state holding them to the fire, we'd have ended up with a cleanup that no one would have been very happy with. Whereas I think now we have a cleanup where most people are happy. There's still some activists who are never going to be happy, but a lot of the local politicians who used to berate me and get on their soapboxes during all these public meetings, I don't know. I get the impression they're largely happy with the way it turned out.
And do you think that people that have followed it closely have the information to know?
People who have followed it closely definitely have the information to know. Yeah. Because, boy, we went over it and over it and over it in all these public meetings. For hours and hours. The people who wanted to follow it closely had all kinds of opportunity to get up and educated on the... And a lot of people would come into the process all with a lot of energy thinking, Rocky Flats, this is a bad deal. I mean, it seemed to me that a lot of people came into the process and, say, joined the Citizens Advisory Board thinking, oh, this is going to be a real mess. I need to get involved. And when I think, and certainly other people involved may disagree with this, but I thought a lot of people came on and realized, oh, well, this seems, it's a big problem, but people seem to have a handle on it, and there seems to be logic behind the process here, and fairly sound thinking behind the decisions for cleanup levels and the like. And then they would just drop out. So there was a very dedicated core people who hated the process to the end and hated the project and the cleanup till the end, and still do, I'm sure. But I don't think they're representative of the community, very representative of the community as a whole.
What do you think, do you have worries over the long run? I mean, what do you think might be the most serious kind of problem that could turn up 50 years from now or 500 years from now? Or is it something you worry about?
Personally, I don't have any big concerns. I'm much more worried about global warming, about acidification of the oceans, about mercury in our lakes. There's so many big environmental problems. The end of peak oil. There's so many big environmental problems and societal problems that I never think about Rocky Flats. I think, yeah, I wouldn't personally go up there and drink the water out of the ponds very often. But if I was thirsty, I'd probably do it, because I know it's, I wouldn't make a habit out of it, but I think the risks up there are pretty small. And when you consider the risks, and like I said, compared to the risks of global climate change, global overheating, just all the problems that come out of all the fossil fuels we burn, I'm happy to forget about Rocky Flats and think about more pressing environmental issues.
And now, when did your role at Rocky Flats end? It was a couple of years ago or something?
Right. Well, yeah.
So
it would have been...
You didn't work through to the recent You haven't been involved in the last couple of years, is that right?
That's correct.
Uh-huh.
The fall of 2003.
And was that a shift? Did someone else replace you, or was the EPA's job done at that point?
Someone else replaced me.
Okay.
Yeah, I took another job in the agency, and they replaced me.
I see. Uh-huh. Was that your choice?
Yes, it was.
Okay.
Yeah, one I've never regretted.
Okay. Was there anything that just pushed you to the, was just time to leave, or?
Yeah, no, it wasn't one thing. For a while, I worked on that project 7 years.
Uh-huh.
And it seemed to me that, especially once we got the 903 pad pretty much done, it just seemed to me that after I'd been on there 4 years, I thought, well, I'm getting a little tired of this project. And I'm a little bit worried that if I'd done so much cleanup work, so much radiation cleanup work, I began to think I might be pigeonholed as someone who could only do a certain type of project. So I started thinking, I'm going to stick it out to the 903 pad because I really want to make sure that gets done right. And Kaiser-Hill kept trying to push off the 903 pad, and
So
we
you had a lot of work to do to keep.
They a couple times they wanted to. Well, they did push off that project a couple times, and they wanted to push it off further. And finally, we just drew a line in the sand and said, no. I'm concerned that this project. If we wait till all the plutonium's gone from the site, then Congress may lose interest in this project, and we may not get the funding to do the job of cleanup that we really need to do here. So.
And that would involve the removal of a lot of the soil.
Yeah,
right?
exactly. All the worst contaminated dirt. So EPA said no, and to the state, to their credit, they totally backed us up on that. And because of that, we got the 903 pad done. And then once that was done, I thought, geez, I could do other things. They don't need me to.
I usually ask people what are the most difficult experiences, and then what are the most rewarding. I think you've already spoken to
A lot of it difficult.
Are there other things that were difficult that we haven't touched on?
I don't know that. Yeah, I think we probably touched on most of them. As we were negotiating the final cleanup levels. So, we went out with the original cleanup levels, community got into an uproar, DOE agreed to fund a revision or a relook at the cleanup levels, so they actually funded a recalculation. And then we took this
is the soil action.
And the soil action levels, right. And then we took that information and then basically used that to inform another recalculation of soil action levels, and coming up with that reissuing that final how clean is clean piece was the most difficult, because I really felt I really felt that the state didn't think that the levels needed to be as low as I thought. So I ended up being in a number of meetings where I felt it was me against the world. The DOE was in there, the contractor was in there, the state was in there, not saying much, and I was arguing for some lower levels, and those were difficult meetings.
Yeah. Do you think that they were just depending on you to be the hard ass? Or,
No, I think they would have been happy if I'd have caved.
Oh.
And it was an issue of, we'd already agreed that the surface should be very clean, but they were going to allow more contamination in the subsurface because you can't get to it and the plutonium doesn't move in the groundwater. So the question was, how far do we take that surface limit down? And Kaiser-Hill wanted to take it 6 inches. I wanted to take it 6 feet. And after months and months of arguing, we took it to 3 feet. But it was all those was just me arguing against.
Just you.
Yeah. So that was the tough part.
Yeah. And in those kind of negotiations, there were no activists present, right?
Right, exactly.
So, yeah.
Right. Yeah, if there was activists present, I would have looked like a hero.
Yeah. Was that must have been an issue, that you were doing a lot of this behind the scenes and sort of never got credit for it?
Well, I don't know. It wasn't an issue for me.
Okay.
Well, I don't know. And maybe the job would have seemed easier. Coming out of some of those meetings, maybe it would have seemed easier if someone had come and pat me on the back and said, I appreciate you looking out for our interest on that. So maybe that made it a little easier. But I knew I was doing the right thing, so I didn't worry about that.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know, the gratifying parts, I don't know, maybe some of the gratifying things are that same issue, knowing at the very end that I held to my beliefs, and Rocky Flats is a much better cleanup. I mean, the fact that I don't worry about Rocky Flats anymore is because we agreed to a pretty low cleanup level.
Mm-hmm.
And we watched and made sure they do it. So I don't know. I'm looking forward in years to come to going out and hiking on the wildlife refuge.
Uh-huh. So you will do that?
Oh, definitely.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, it's a neat place. You get down into those little valleys. You can't see Boulder. You can't see Denver. You just see the prairie the way it was years and years ago.
Uh-huh.
And I definitely look forward to going out and I don't know that I feel it so much right now, but I know I will experience some pride in knowing that I was a key person in getting it to that point.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
And, I mean, if there's a bright cloud in the whole Rocky Flats history, it's that you have 6 square miles up there that's never going to be developed.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of nice wildlife there, and it's clean.
You have confidence that the wildlife refuge, the legacy management will remain. It will remain as a wildlife refuge then.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know that I should have confidence in politicians, but I do have confidence in the public's fear of plutonium.
Uh-huh. You've had a lot of experience with it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, I think our tape may be about to run out. Would you be willing to talk for a few more minutes if I change the tape? How much time do you have?
I could talk for a few more minutes.
Okay.
15 or so?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Great.